Hey everyone, I'm Ethan. I am an AI engineering manager at Square, and I drink just regular old black drip coffee.
I think this is it. Mike, welcome, man. You are our guest host of
Hey.
honor today. It's great to have you here, man.
Thank you for having me.
So, we just got off of an interview with Ethan Rosenthal. He is working at Square. He's doing some really cool stuff, and I thought it was timely around the blurb that you just wrote about large language models. He was talking about how they're using large language models. All that stuff was awesome. And then we dove into a little feature store conversation and his hopes and dreams for feature store / monitoring solutions. What were your takeaways?
First of all, Ethan's super. It's like a privilege to talk to someone who's such a clear thinker, but also kind of like so deep in all of the technology and the organizational things that are really needed to get ML into production. So it was a great convo. Things that stood out to me, the relationship between the AI engineers and the product managers. It's something we don't talk about very much, but he brought it up and he was like, you got to get this right. If you don't get this right, then either you're not focusing on the business problems in the right way, or the PMs are not going to understand the tech appropriately to help make the right decisions. The other thing is streaming databases. What is their future role in things like ML monitoring and feature stores? Thinking about some of the tech implications for the future stack of ML is really interesting. So I thought it was a great combo. Super. He's just a sharp guy, and you guys should have him back here again and again.
Yeah.
What about you, D? What stood out to you?
So for me, I actually really liked this idea that you presented. It's a little bit off the beaten path. There was, of course, everything that you said just now about Ethan, and I knew you were going to call out the product manager piece, being an ex-product manager, right? You're like, yes, we need more credit
Finally,
out there
you're
in
talking
the
about
organization. But one thing that I liked you talking about and bringing up the point of is the trade-offs when you're looking at these, basically going from very specific model use cases to and using many different models to one model that you're just throwing everything at, and it is for many use cases, and how you have to keep in mind now and kind of level up and see things from a different place in the business. So that was a huge takeaway for me, because I hadn't heard that talked about, like, that transition from using hundreds or thousands of models for very specific things to using bigger models that you just throw things
Yeah, the
at.
idea is like, instead of having, like, even at Uber as an example, we had one model that for every single city, right? We had like 600 models we were managing, and that was just for a certain use case, say for ETA prediction. But what Ethan was talking about is not just bringing all of those kinds of models together, but bring multiple models that do different things together into one big model.
Yeah.
And then the question is, okay, now we want to launch a new version of this model. It doesn't only affect one use case; it affects all these other use cases too. So now we have to make trade-offs across like areas of the product, and that leads to new and interesting discussions. So
Which is,
I'm sure this is going to come up again and again.
Yeah, and it makes me think that's probably why his love, or a little bit of where his love for monitoring stems from. You can tell that he is. I mean, he tried to build in 2019 his own monitoring solution, and or he did build it, and then he ended up joining Square. So that seems to me like a little bit of a precursor for now what he's doing. So that's awesome. Let's get into it with Ethan. Without further ado, we're going to do it. And by the way, if anyone out there is listening and they have not signed up for our newsletter that we just referenced throughout this episode, you can do so at MLOps.community or in the link in the description. And we would love it if you can give us some feedback or stars or a follow, a like, all that, whatever you can do to let the algorithm know that this is where it's at and this is a cool podcast. We super appreciate that. Now, let's jump into it. All right, let's get this cracking. Ethan, Mike, both of you. It's awesome to have you both here. And Ethan, especially, like, I want to dive into what you're doing at Square. I want to know everything that there is to know about your team, the way that you all are operating, and a bit of your history on that. I know you mentioned that you were on the fraud team and now you're doing new stuff. So let's just start with, like, what team are you on?
Good question. Yeah, so I'm on a team called the Conversations team. We're like a small little team, like in the corner of the business somewhere. So we build a product called Square Messages, which is a messaging hub for Square businesses to be able to communicate with their customers. So, maybe you, let's say, sign up for an appointment at the hair salon. You might get a text message confirming your appointment. You can then respond to that text message, and that message will go into, like, all these text messages go into one place where the business owner can read through them and respond to them. So texts, emails, other things like that. Yeah, so my team builds that product, and then I run a small team of AI engineers who add, let's call them like smart features to this. So
Uh-huh.
we have a chat bot. So if you want to, let's say, reschedule an appointment that you've scheduled, you can talk in natural language to this chatbot, and it will, work with you in order to reschedule, which saves the business owner from missing out on sales and things like that. We also have a feature called suggested replies. So you know how like Gmail will suggest a response for you to send back to an email? We do the
Oh,
same
yeah.
thing for business owners so that they can quickly respond to their customers. So you can imagine lots of natural language processing, language models, which are pretty hot right now, and other
Oh,
sorts of
yeah.
things like that we work on.
And Ethan, when you work on a team like this, it was interesting to me how you described it. You said we work on some smart features, and we work with a bunch of teams who describe themselves like that as well. It's not just like I'm the fraud team and I detect fraud. It's I'm on this product team and I'm trying to improve the product in a whole number of ways, and anybody on my team might end up working on any of many different opportunities we have to improve the product. Is that so? One, is that accurate? Is that how you think about it? And then two, is that something like of a trend that you're seeing where people are moving more to just being like the AI engineering crew on a product, and we work on a lot of different ways to improve it rather than just this one really high value use case?
Yeah, I guess it probably depends on your team, and I'm guessing it depends on your relationship with product managers, right? So I think there's definitely been teams that I've worked on where, let's say, PMs have features that they want built. And so you have, let's say, a lot of inbound requests to the AI team, and it's the AI team's job to kind of solve for these things. The flip side of this is that often non-technical stakeholders might not know what AI and machine learning are capable of, and so then the ML team needs to come up with these ideas themselves. And my team kind of sits in the middle somewhere. So there's like kind of obvious business use cases where we want to inject some smart features, but then there's also lots of kind of greenfield areas where we are coming up with the ideas of what we can do, and then we work with product people, we work with designers and things like that in order to understand, can we actually build out a product or a feature out of these crazy ideas that we have.
Mhm.
That's pretty fascinating how that relationship with the product manager is so important because you may be an AI ML engineer on a team and your product manager may just not get it, and it's probably pretty hard for you to be able to get the same type of impact. Um, it makes me just think about like how important the product manager role is on these types of products, where it hasn't been necessarily like the primary persona that we're talking about.
Mike
Yeah.
speaking like a true product
Yeah,
manager
I'm a,
here.
I'm a product guy, so that's why I bring this up.
No,
Uh,
it's hugely important. I think it's probably easy for engineers and data people to kind of scoff at product managers and things like that. But I work with a great product manager right now, and it is so freaking helpful compared to other scenarios that I've been in where you don't have great product support. But I'm sure, Mike, that you're aware, it's very hard to find product managers that are able to, like, I think product is hard enough just for regular quote software engineers, but then to start to work with data people, ML people, it's just even harder to find good people.
It's
But they're
super
very
super
valuable
hard.
when you
Yeah.
find them.
Yeah, we're hiring PMs at Tecton, but yeah, it's so hard. Like it's because you need a certain level of data science intuition. You need a certain level of engineering. It's not just you need to be technical, somewhat technical. You need the data science intuition as well, so that scopes down the population in a big way. And the thing that I always look for in a product manager is just that they're really, really, really smart and they can make good decisions. And so that is an even bigger filter. That's why it's so tough. So it's good that you're working with the right person right now.
Got lucky on this team.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you insinuated at it. I want to know especially because Mike just wrote something in the Mega Ops newsletter that we have that went out a day or two ago. Large language models. Is it all hype? Where do you see them playing into your workflow and how like you actually get work done?
Yeah, so we full on use them. We train them, we deploy them, and they're pretty incredible. I don't know. So I think we're kind of going through, I don't know, an inflection point or something like that, where lots and lots of applications of natural language processing, which might have been, you might have had different bespoke solutions for different tasks. Let's say question answering or text classification or things like that. These can kind of all be solved by large language models and possibly by the exact same large language model. And so it's kind of a constant question on our team. How many different, let's say, use cases of a model do we want to fit into a single
Oh,
model?
yeah, nice.
There's benefits there, but then like this is the MLOps podcast, right? Like there's like operationally, it's maybe easier to have one model, but then and maybe we'll talk about this later. Like if you want to start automatically retraining this model and you have multiple tasks, then it makes life a lot more difficult. But it's a very fun area right now, and I feel like there's it's unclear exactly how much we can shove into single models and be successful with, but yeah.
That's interesting. And just to clarify, D made it sound like I wrote something that said it's all hype, and that's not the. It's just that
I was
it was
throwing you under the bus.
misworded in some way. That's not at all what I was saying. But yeah, that's fascinating. I think so. One thing, playing around with like GPT-3 that I've noticed, and I've been messing around with it to generate prompts for Dolly and stuff like that, just as like a side thing. But it gets things totally wrong pretty frequently, and so this whole notion of prompt engineering is really I believe it's going to be like a very huge thing, and it's kind of just something that we it's just so new that we don't talk about it too much. But my realization is that like it's pretty easy to have just like totally wacky like outputs from these large language models. And from a product manager perspective, that makes me think about like what use cases is something like this at the current stage of this technology applicable to. And I think the types of use cases are ones where mistakes are not really high cost. And so I wonder if that's something that your team has been thinking about, like when we're figuring out where we can apply this stuff. Let's focus on the ones where if we get it wrong, it's not that big of a deal, as opposed to like I don't know, something where it's some fraud thing or whatever. It costs us $1 million. Is that the kind of conversations you're having internally? Like how are you taking this new technology and then figuring out internally like how do we apply it? What are the big questions you're figuring out?
Yeah. So those are great points. We can put guardrails in place, right? So like right now we suggest a response, so a string of text that we think that that the merchant can send back to their customer, and we have a bunch of filters after that point in order to make sure that we're not showing suggestions that are obviously dangerous or bad. So, for example, we don't want to leak PII into the suggestions that we're generating. And so we have detectors for that, and we make sure to suppress any text that might contain PII and things like that. Uh, Models are trained off of biased data, and so we don't want to start manifesting those biases as well. But at the end of the day, this isn't perfect, And I think one big question for us in the team is how do we want to deal with the human that is in the loop of our system? So I mentioned that we have a chatbot. That chatbot is basically fully automated. If the chatbot can't handle something, then it alerts the business owner to have them,
Hmm.
swoop in. But for, if we are just suggesting a response to say, it's kind of okay if it's not great, right? Nobody's gonna lose lots of money. Like I used to work in recommendation systems, and I worked for like a beauty products company, and I was like, all right, like if you get suggested the wrong lipstick, you're going to be okay. But
Yeah.
then, as you mentioned, for fraud use cases, it's much more important. And so I think that how much you rely on the human in the loop uh, is a way to kind of navigate how much you're willing to allow for like basically how conservative you have to be with your models.
And these are the, just to bring it back to the thing we were saying before, this kind of understanding of the cost of a false positive or something like that is something that is very important for the product manager to be able to think through with a really deep intuition. And so it's one of the things we're always evaluating, like, do you get it really? Because it's a whole new domain of dimension of like product understanding and technology understanding that you have that really affects it's a primary factor in the end product experience. And um, and so like how I think like how the product teams and like your team work together is kind of like this new thing. And sounds like you guys are figuring it out, but a lot of people are still just, they're like, so like we don't even have a product manager who knows anything about this, but they're taking Ethan's course right now. Something like that. What advice would you have for other folks in there, kind of like, I'm an ML engineer and I got a product manager who's not an expert at this stuff. How can I work really effectively with that person?
Yeah, I think one key piece is stepping out of your narrow domain and trying to explain things in the context of, let's say, non-technical stakeholders. And so one piece is defining your metrics in terms of business metrics as opposed to model metrics. I most like 99.9% of the people in the world don't know what the area under an ROC curve is, and so like you just shouldn't even be telling somebody that. It's not to say that you shouldn't try to teach people things. So I used to work on the risk team at Square, and lots and lots of people across the broader risk org understand what precision and recall curves look like because these are metrics that they kind of have to live and breathe. But not all teams are going to be like that, and so I think you know I think I guess it starts with metrics probably, and it's sometimes hard for ML people to be able to think through those product metrics. But I think how your model interacts with the full ecosystem that it's in. I Not to get too like thought leadery, but I think that that's like over the next 5 years, like that is where the real work is involved.
Yeah.
It's getting easier and easier for us to build models, deploy them, and everything else. But actually, understanding their interaction in the ecosystem it's a lot of work, and you can't really get around it. So
Yeah, and I was going in the direction of like, how do we get a product manager who understands the business, but not the technology, to be able to work better with the technical people, but also your point is like the technical people need to understand, if they're going to be effective, they need to understand the business at the end of the day.
both sides,
And
both sides have
yeah,
to meet each other in the middle.
yeah, that's important.
Yeah, it
And
reminds me of when we talked to Hannes, who worked at this company called Digits, and he was saying how his whole team, like they get together with the front end and designers a lot just to know what kind of things they're looking for and they're interested in. And then if they're changing things, they also get those signals, and they get updated beforehand, or ideally like they're all on the same page when things are being changed, so that in case anything breaks because of a change, they know about it and it doesn't break because they get that premonition. And so it's a little bit like that. Like they have to be able to speak to each other in a way. And what you're saying makes sense. It kind of follows that same line of thought, where you want to be able to speak to a product manager. You want the product manager to be able to speak to you. And so how can you both find that that overlap in the Venn
A
diagram.
common understanding.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
A lot of,
So,
I feel like everybody has different vocabulary terms for the same things,
yeah,
right? And so even just agreeing on that, I mean, even in machine learning, you have statistics, you have computer science, they have the same terms for the same, inference versus prediction, and everybody interprets these things differently. And so even, even just dealing with the vocabulary is hard sometimes.
And Ethan, you touched on like some of the MLOps concerns around this, and that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. We're g- so D was just saying, Demetrios was just saying, hey, we published this MLOps Mega Ops newsletter the other day, and one of the things that I wrote a little snippet, and it was about um, like, hey, there's large language models, and I was talking about like the text to image stuff particularly, but this stuff's really useful, and we're super early days, and I think the large language stuff is farther along in its maturity and adoption in industry than like the text to image stuff, but that it's still early. And so while we have all these well-known years of MLOps best practices that have accumulated in MLOps community, where somebody can go and take a course on this is how this company or this company runs, their decision tree in production, and this is who does what and stuff like that. It's my understanding that how to do that with large language models is still very early, both in what people's responsibilities are and what are the best practices for training. Oh, did we lose Demetrios? And training and retraining and monitoring this stuff in production and stuff like that. Are you dealing with? So now coming from a fraud team to this team, are you dealing with fundamentally new MLOps challenges, and what kinds of challenges are presented, if so?
Yeah, I think that we're definitely dealing with new challenges. I think one of the big challenges is trying to fit lots of use cases or tasks, whatever we want to call this, into the same model. And so,
Yeah, that's interesting.
like a lot of, I'm sure that for people who have maybe a more robust MLOps setup or something like that, they've built out a framework or an abstraction layer around how their models are used, and maybe they have mapped this model can be used for this use case or something like that. And we might version an entire model artifact, but if you start to combine multiple tasks into uh, like one model, then you can imagine that um, like you now have multiple use cases that are mapped to the same model. You might want to only update portions of this model. So, like fine tuning is a popular thing with language models. You might only be fine tuning a portion of a model. Maybe it's just a transformer head that pops off of a large backbone. And so, how do you start to version these like these components, these artifact components that end up being combined into one thing? How do you version, let's say, like pre-trained embeddings as opposed to downstream tasks? And if you are
Yeah.
updating these embeddings, then you now have this cascading effect where you have to update all of the downstream tasks. And so there's a part of me that's like this is just so painful. Like life is easier if you just have like simple models for each task. Um, Although, if you're deploying simple models for every single different task, then there is like an infrastructure overhead to deploying all these things as opposed to deploying one model. But it's like the
Yeah.
moment you change anything is when, the moment you update a model is when life gets hard.
And there's always some benefits to centralization and some costs to it. And and so it sounds like you're kind of like hitting some of those trade-offs. We dealt with some similar things at Google. I used to be product manager on the machine learning team for Google's ad stuff to choose which ads you see when you type something into search. And we went through this like big. It sounds very related to what you were saying. This big change from having a lot of models where there would be a model per country and a model per desktop or mobile kind of thing to the one mega model. And it was like, now we just have this one model. Maybe we have different versions of it to manage, but there's just this one big model, and we don't have to worry about like 1,000 different models that we're managing. And at Uber, we actually had the 1,000 different models, and they went through the similar thing of like centralizing things. The benefit of that centralization was, yeah, there's less models to manage, but secondly, the model can kind of like learn better just has more data, so it can learn things that it can apply to one region that it'll learn from another region. And if you set the model up properly, you can actually just have that the model learn like region specific things. But we had to do a lot of like careful construction of the models in those times. This is kind of like pre deep learning for a lot of the stuff that we did at Google. Um, how do you so in the world that you're in, when you think about like, oh, we're going to have this one thing that's going to be useful for a variety of different tasks, what kind of work do you have to put in to manage the kind of like what data can affect learning, what kinds of learnings, and how the behavior can be different across various tasks? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think it's, that's one of the issues, right? Is that your tasks can affect other tasks. And so when you have a single model, I can just focus on metrics for that model. But now if I am training a model on multiple tasks, then maybe this new model is better for certain tasks, but worse for other tasks. And so kind of making sure that, like, I guess you're taking a portfolio approach to model improvement or something like that. Um, ends up being important. But I think it's also just a trade-off from like an operational standpoint around, like, is it actually worth it to try to fit this task into this other model, or would life just be easier if we train this task separately? I do think that, especially for natural language processing, the ability to do like few shot learning is extremely appealing for large language models. So we have a number of
Do you want to just
supervised.
explain what that is for everybody in case it's kind of new?
Yeah, yeah. So like a classic natural language processing task is to do classification on a piece of text. And so typically you need some labeled data in order to classify that text. And it can be expensive to collect this data. So we have humans annotate lots and lots of data points for us so that we can train supervised problems on there. But the idea of few shot or zero shot learning is that you might only need a couple labeled examples for a model to be able to learn that classification task. And large language models have shown that they're pretty good at learning from very few labeled examples. And so, like, not only does that reduce cost because you don't have to send out a lot of data for labeling, but it reduces a lot of operational headache around collecting quality labels and things like that. And all of a sudden now you have opened up the ability for your model to start to solve lots and lots of different tasks.
Yeah, it's what came to mind as you were kind of talking through some of the trade-offs that you have to make is that in any team that's deploying models, there's rarely just this one number that they're optimizing for. It's rarely just like, oh, we're just increasing revenue and that's all we care about, because maybe you're increasing revenue, short-term revenue, but you're increasing unsubscribe rate, and it's going to kill you in long-term revenue or something. So every business has their own, like, people ultimately are looking at uh, a number of metrics within their use case, that there's always conversations between all the different people in the team around, like, how do we really trade these things off? And what is kind of an interesting, what sounds like it's an interesting new challenge that your team is dealing with, and presumably other teams in your position, is these trade-offs are not, what's the right way to say it, intra-team, but now you have trade-offs that, we're evaluating this new model, but it's going to affect how this other team's use case works now, because it's this model affects all these other teams different, like all these different use cases at the same time. And so that really requires someone to be able to make trade-offs at a little bit of a higher level, where you're able to say, okay, well, we're getting this capability, like, I'm just making these use cases up, but like our replies to the businesses or to the customers are more accurate, but the troubleshooting language is kind of like less accurate now. Are we okay with that change? Are you seeing like the kind of level at the trade-offs that you have to make change now as well?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, we are early in our
Okay,
journey,
everybody's early.
right? So, like, we have combined some things, but we have, like, not everything lives. Not all of our use cases yet live in a single model. But yeah, I think, like, that's totally true. Where you have to now, uh, not just navigate the difficult metrics for your single model, which, as you said, are could involve well, has this metric gone up constrained by the fact that this other metric has not gone down below some level, but now we have this across tasks. And so and then and that's not so bad for across tasks, but you can also imagine just even for an individual task. Let's say that we are generating text. We might be generating text better for certain subsets of our population than other subsets. And each time you retrain your model, that the distribution of your performance across your population can change. And so, how do you make sure that you're kind of maintaining sufficient performance for, let's say, protected subsets?
Hmm. So I want to change gears a little bit because you've written some incredible blog posts, and one of which picked up quite a bit of steam. And I want to jump into the unbundling slash bundling. And this one specifically is all about the unbundling of Airflow, I think is what it was that you, and correct me if I'm wrong. And
I,
I see
I
you,
I think I
you
was
wanted to say
commenting
something.
on that blog post as a way to just tee up my own blog post. So
There you go. That's it. And so I'm wondering when it comes to the unbundling and rebundling argument, especially on this building performant databases, which is what your blog post goes into, right? Where do you stand on it now? Have things changed, or you still you still
Maybe
taking the
just
same
summarize the
position?
point for everybody as well.
Yeah, that's
Let
probably
me.
good.
So I think I still agree with what I wrote a couple months ago, but that's ask me in a couple months, and I'm sure that'll change. But the main argument of the blog post was that there's kind of a couple different areas of, let's say, MLOps tooling or data tooling nowadays. Um, let's say feature stores, machine learning monitoring tools, and I guess metrics layers, which I admittedly don't know much about, and I feel like they're also just worse defined than the other two tools. But the point of the blog post was that each of these different kind of specific use cases are all kind of generalizations of the same idea, and that presumably with modern streaming databases, we can kind of build out those tools as opposed to needing specific vendors for this. Not to say that we don't necessarily need vendors for this, but yeah. And so the overarching idea was that, like, if you take something like a feature store or monitoring machine learning models, there's kind of like two key components to this. So one is that you need to be able to serve up kind of aggregated statistics quickly in real time. So for a feature store, maybe I need to know, uh, you know, how many transactions has this merchant processed in the last 60 seconds? Maybe that's a feature that's interesting to me, and I'm using that in order to detect fraud or something like that. And so your feature store needs to serve up that number very quickly. And so the feature store might be consuming streams of events, and then we are aggregating those events into a single number that we have to serve up fast. Machine learning monitoring, same idea. It's hard to talk about the performance metrics of a single model prediction, but you might look at, what is my model's uh, accuracy over some time period? Let's say like a trailing, like 1 week accuracy, perhaps. So that's one piece, is that you have to be able to serve up these aggregated statistics fast. The other piece is that you typically want to be able to understand what were those statistics values at previous points in time. So for a feature store, maybe you want to train your model off of historical data, and your historical data needs to be, maybe you need to know for that transaction that was processed a year ago, how many transactions had that merchant processed in the prior, hour. And uh, so to support both of these systems, it's really really complicated. It's like very very painful from an infrastructure standpoint. I'm sure Mike is well aware. There's entire companies that do this, and they're very necessary. But in my blog post, I talk about this, like these new streaming databases, like for example Materialize, where you kind of get this support out of these databases. And so what I'm kind of putting out to the world is maybe we can start to build these sorts of tools on top of these databases, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. I've been playing around, but nothing big yet. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I think it totally could work. and it's one of the things that we've had to be like as we've been building Tecton, we're keeping a close eye on all of this streaming is a really big use case for feature stores because it's one of the hardest things to get right. And so um, it's it's not a thing that we see as, hey, now you can replace your feature store completely with this thing, but it's more like, hey, the data processing engine for a pretty big subset of feature use cases may be replaceable by some, like we may have like the feature store plug into a streaming database. What we found though is that they're all really early, so
Yeah.
we haven't like really like we've wanted to. This is kind of just like a little bit like what's happening in practice right now. We want to use them because they just the promise is so awesome,
Make
and
your job easier.
yeah, I mean, like I can't tell you how because we take on a lot of complexity for our customers.
I'm
Our
sure.
customers come to us and they're like, "Hey, streaming features kills us, so can we use your feature store and just make it way easier for us, right?" And like, you know, Square is an example
Yeah.
of that, and so we help them do that. However, it's not like streaming is solved now. Streaming is still just as hard. We just have the ML wrapper around it and a lot of management and simplification stuff that we provide. So it's a much simpler API for data scientists. Behind the scenes, we got to deal with all the complexity. And so we would love if there's a really nice streaming engine that could support like these use cases, but to meet and I think they're getting there. And so I think very soon we're going to see for a lot of these use cases that kind of engine be able to be useful for a lot of feature store use cases. But a lot of the like if you're listening to this from like a big tech company or company with like a really large scale, we've been also trying to explore these for those use cases, and the kind of like latency and scale needs uh, is have been a little extreme for those in a way that has pushed the streaming databases outside of their like comfort zone. So I think it's kind of early to apply those to the larger companies, but it's going to get there, and we're really optimistic about it. So yeah, so we're keeping an eye on them, and I think it's a really good point. Like not a ton of people have. Not a ton of people know about the streaming database stuff, and so we don't get asked about it too much. But I'm keeping a close eye on it because I want to bring that into Tecton.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's ironically, yeah, they're probably not great for larger companies that have stringent feature store requirements. They're probably great for much smaller companies. Like I used to work at some e-commerce startups in New York, and uh, we kind of had our own very hacky way of serving some features in production with like 1 day latency, let's call it. They
Yeah,
get updated once a day, and you load everything into memory, and it would have been great to use a streaming database there, but probably those smaller companies might still not know what feature stores are yet, and so it's. I think eventually, right? Like eventually, feature stores will become more unanimous, and then possibly for the lower end use cases, the streaming databases will be able to solve for that.
yeah, and what we find is even for the really lower end use cases, you don't even need streaming often, or you don't
Yeah.
need so like a lot of the cool stuff of streaming databases is and someone will say, yeah, but I could just use like my any database. I could just have batch features only and I'm fine. So what happens is machine learning teams go through this is how we see it. Like machine learning teams go through this kind of like journey of maturity, and they want to start simple, and then they grow to doing what like Block is doing today, and along that journey they don't really know what they're requiring. If you're at stage one, you're not thinking about, hey, what are my technical requirements going to be at stage two? And so that's kind of a funny thing because we're asking people to choose what's the technology you're gonna need when you're 3 stages ahead, because you're making your plans for 3 stages from now. And so part of like the kind of interesting challenge that people deal with in the ML ops space is how do you adopt the tools that will grow with you along the way. And we think about that when building Tekton, but I think the point that you're making is like, hey, there's another stage of like where there's a nice technology fit for a certain level of sophistication, and that's simplifying things for people in that stage, but it's also making the like story for people. It's just adding another system where it's like another thing you got to know of like how it fits in with other things.
Yeah, and I think my hope would be that these streaming databases can replace having multiple systems. And so, you know, like ideally your feature store and your model monitoring can all be done in one place. And like and then that way also if your other data lives there, then you're able to kind of connect both your modeling workflow and your analytics back to features that are used and your model's performance and things like that. So like one of the things that I write in the blog post is that like I don't want to send my data to some tool. I'd rather the tool come to my data. And so, when I think of like a machine learning monitoring tool, like how do I calculate the performance of my machine learning model? It's very rarely something as simple as like precision and recall. It's going to be some complicated business metric. So maybe let's say it's like fraud. Maybe we are conditioning our events on certain things having happened, and maybe we want to weight our precision and recall by some loss value and a bunch of other things. And so you know like to do that, typically you write like a big gnarly snowflake query in order to calculate that. But then, in order to get that very complicated metric into, let's say, a machine learning monitoring tool, if you want it to be served up and if you want to be able to monitor this in real time, you might have to then reconstruct all of that same logic in order to send it to that tool. Or for feature stores. So if I'm calculating really useful features in my feature store, ideally I'd like to be able to run some analytics queries that are able to use those features. And so
Yep, absolutely.
what sometimes happens is you first have to query Snowflake and then you query the feature store, and maybe in Python you are joining these things together. And ideally, my analyses and like my production, like features and monitoring values and things like that are all coming from the exact same process.
Yep, and I think like there's this trade-off that you're highlighting, which is if you um, if you choose a tool that is very specialized, sometimes it comes with some level of like siloing, right? And then you're
Yeah.
kind of locked into this tool. And the benefit of that tool might be like, hey, it's got these really amazing workflows end to end that are specialized for your use case. But then it kind of like keeps all your stuff in that world, and then when you're when you're building a real-time dashboard, your normal analytics tools like don't integrate with it or whatever, and so you give up on a lot of like standardization and centralization. And then the other option is, hey, keep everything in this one standardized, like let's use Snowflake for everything kind of thing, and all the tools can plug into it, but you may be missing out on, imagine it's a monitoring tool, all of the predefined monitoring metrics that you would get, and then you're stuck like rebuilding all these things and managing all the definitions of these metrics and stuff like that. One thing that we think a lot about, and I like that you're highlighting this trade-off, is how do you get the best of both worlds, right? How do you
Yeah.
or how do you like not have the negatives of either world, where you want to avoid siloing, so you want the tool to plug into as much as possible your existing data stack, but you want to also get like the cool stuff that that tool provides, which is all the metrics or all the workflows or the part of the experience that makes life more productive, more effective for the, say, the data scientist or whoever. And certainly like streaming databases provide like a new point there, right? Because it helps you like achieve some of the technical things that both worlds provide in a little bit of a much more unified way, which is really nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dude, so Ethan, this is the beauty of the internet. I got to ask before we go, because we're starting to get down on time. What is Rosenthal data, and why is that not your thing anymore? What happened there?
Oh, so let's see. Before I came to Square, so I joined Square like right before the pandemic hit, so early 2020. Before that, I was freelancing, so I was like freelance data scientist, machine learning engineer, building some things for people around the country, which is very fun. And then I got this idea because I kept building things for people, and then if you build out like a production machine learning model for somebody, you just hand over this like giant pile of code and infrastructure to them that if they don't have any in-house people, they're like, thank you. And then I guarantee, I try to write good code, but it's going to break at some point. All these systems break. And so at the time, I was like, oh man, there needs to be a tool to be able to monitor how machine learning models are performing in production. And so I tried very briefly to start a startup doing this. So I spent about 6 months, built a POC. I got really hung up on this data issue of like, how do I store large volumes of data and join them together and calculate these aggregated statistics? Like, this is why I'm like so interested in the data side of things. But yeah, I basically I couldn't find any customers, and I decided to call it quits. And then I took a job, and the pandemic hit, and I was really thankful to have a W-2 when the pandemic hit. So
Well, then,
that was that.
yeah, how do you see the monitoring space now? Because it feels like in 2019, it wasn't as populated as it is, and now I would say it's one of the most crowded spaces. So you obviously weren't the only one having that idea in 2019.
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell if me writing this blog post about like let's replace monitoring tools with streaming databases is just me being bitter, but I'd like to think that this is an actual constructive, comment to the community. But who knows? Like. I'm glad that there's lots of companies doing it. I think it's super important. We have a contract at Square. My team doesn't use them, but Block does have a contract with the model monitoring tool, and like I still stand by the original idea that like it's important for us to be able to monitor these models, and it's non-trivial. It's like you can't just use Datadog for this. At the same time, I kind of just wish there weren't so many tools. There's like the whole space of MLOps is so fragmented, and I just don't like integrating with things. So
Ethan, I'd love to just ask you if we have another minute just about your time freelancing. What was that like? I've never freelanced. Where did you find jobs? What was the good part? What were the good parts about it? What was really tough?
Yeah, so network is key, I would say. So thankfully, I had worked at and quit at a number of companies by that point. So I had a good network of like former coworkers to lean on. And so that's where I guess I
Classic.
got a lot of my business. But it's like, it was really exciting, right? So I was really focused on I want to build production machine learning models for people, and so that's where I tried to narrow my business, and I got to do it. And so it was like it's really fun, just kind of swooping into different areas and having to get up to speed really fast. Like I built Bayesian models for this company that was optimizing ad spend on Facebook. I built like time series forecasting models for like a podcast analytics company, like all sorts of things.
And
And
would people come to you with, "Hey, I need this specific model built," or would it be like, "Just help us figure out what to do with data"?
sometimes they'd come to me with a specific model. Sometimes they'd come to me with specific ideas, and then I probably like 80% of the time would turn them away. And I'd say, look, like, you don't even have a data warehouse. Like, you don't even
Yeah.
know what your data is showing you. Like, this idea that you have is a terrible idea. For like, I would, couch my feedback a bit better than that. But a lot of people just like we're not ready for machine learning yet because it's like as we all know it's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
so much freaking work. And so but some people had very good ideas, and I would just come in and build it for them. Um, I think the better if you can get a well-defined project, then you can charge like an entire project fee for it, which is a great way to decouple your time from your money. I got very obsessed with like
Mm.
decoupling my time from my money. But if a business just doesn't really know what they need and they kind of just want you working there for 10 or 20 hours a week, then you get billed hourly, which is fine. But it's all I learned a lot about like the like risk reward trade off. So
Mm.
if you're willing to take on the risk of just charging a fixed fee for something, then it can be a large reward, but you can also get hosed.
And
So
it seems like being really good at choosing the right clients is a very important skill.
yeah, that's the beauty of it is that you don't have to take the job. You can fire clients. I never had to do it,
Hmm.
but every client you sign a contract and you can just say, all right, 10 days notice, I'm out of here. So uh, that helps. Ideally, you don't do that.
Well, so now you are teaching, and I would love to finish on you talking to us about your course that you're doing and how that came about.
Yeah, so I am an adjunct professor at NYU's engineering school. So I'm teaching a course with a friend of mine, Jacopo, who I think has been on this podcast. He must have been on here before.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah, for sure. A few times.
like
And
many
Chiro.
things, yeah, Jacopo wrangled me into doing this. So he co-taught the course last year, and so we're co-teaching this year. So it's an intro to machine learning for financial engineering, and so it's kind of like basically all the way from what is machine learning to actually deploying some models in the cloud with a bit of a financial engineering color to it. And so, uh, yeah, so what we're focusing on is, theory is good to get a bit of a foundation, but I think that building out practical skills for people is a pretty important thing. Like especially nowadays, you don't even have to know math anymore. We have, like deep learning libraries that take derivatives and everything else for you. And so while we touch on some of the theory, I think it's just, linking all the pieces together and building up that mental framework of understanding like what are the inputs to my model, what are the outputs to my model, how do I actually measure like the model's performance and effectiveness. That's what I'm hoping people will take away from it.
And
So,
who's it for, Ethan? Is it for people who know a little bit, or is it for people who are just like, hey, I've never done data science stuff at all, and I'm interested?
so these are masters in financial engineering students, and so they're master students, and they know Python, they know linear algebra and things like that. And most of them seem to know a bit of data science, but they might not know anything about machine learning, and then especially don't know anything about deployment or kind of the system side of things.
Well, I heard they don't like hard classes at NYU, so if you want to keep your job, you better not
I
get
saw
the
that article.
revolt. So don't make it too difficult on those poor students.
Yeah, the warning flags are very clear.
Yeah. Well, dude, this has been awesome, man. Thank you for coming on here and sharing your views and teaching us a few things about what you're doing over there at Square. And yeah, I think we'll just end it there.
Yeah, thank you, Ethan.
Thanks so much for having me.